Okay, I really do not want to hold anyone up, so I'm going to go ahead and get started with today's program. Good evening, everyone, and
Good
welcome to
evening.
Let's Talk About It. Today's theme is Get Up and Stand Up. As many of you know, today started the first day of Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So our plan is to turn Zoom and social media purple today. This webinar will be live on YouTube and social media and will be made for public consumption. Please let us know if you have any concerns. We will also love to hear from you with any questions that you may have. We do have a question section at the bottom of your screen. Any questions you may have, you can place them on there and there will be someone monitoring those questions. My name is Annabelle Gina Cruz. I'm the CEO of Hills of Greatness, and I'm going to be your moderator for today. I will be asking the questions that have been pre-sent to us and been chosen from a committee. I'm also the president of SAFER. Before I introduce our guest for today, can we please have a moment of silence for all the people we've lost due to senseless violence? Thank you very much. I'd like to introduce today's panel, starting with Allison O'Malley, a domestic violence advocate, former CEO of Resolve, an educator of domestic violence and dating violence, and the vice president of SAFER. We are honored to have her here today, and we thank her so much for her being available to us. Thank you, Allie, for being here. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be part of this panel today. So many of my longtime colleagues and friends are on this panel, and it's good to be with you. As Gina mentioned, for the last 12 years, I've been the CEO of Resolve of Greater Rochester, a transitional domestic violence program serving the Greater Rochester and surrounding counties. Our focus was always entirely on how do you rebuild your life. So while most people identify with the crisis point of intimate partner violence or domestic violence, our focus was on something has happened, how do you go forward from here? So not dwelling in the crisis, but acknowledging the crisis, addressing the resulting trauma from the crisis, and then helping people to rebuild their lives. And that is my personal passion. I also happen to be a survivor. I lived with domestic violence the first 25 years of my life, and am deeply committed to engaging new systems in how do we meet and address intimate partner violence. My specific interest area now is healthcare. We need engagement in our healthcare systems to address this problem.
Thank you, Allie, for that. Our next panelist is Lorianne Castell. She is from the New York State Coalition of Domestic Violence, a longtime partner in training and an advocate in our community. Thank you again. Both her and Ellie will be monitoring the questions today. I thank you both so much. Lorianne, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Gina. I'm also really honored to be in this space with all of you, and I'm excited for the conversation today. And Gina, thank you for having a moment of silence to really bring us all into the room together and be present. The seriousness of the issue that we'll be talking about. So I've been with the New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence for 22 years this month. And before
Congratulations.
that, I have no idea what I can attribute the longevity to, except that I'm very, very committed, or should be committed. Before that, I worked for a local domestic violence program and shelter as a shelter advocate, and then as a legal advocate. and couldn't wait to get to the state level so that I could help to influence legislation and state policy. And so that's a lot of what we do at the State Coalition. Every state and tribal territory has a state coalition like ours. And we represent the needs of the 100+ domestic violence programs that are in New York State. Every county in New York State has at least one domestic violence program. And then, of course, as you get down south towards New York City, there may be one or two. New York City has a dozen. And our reason for being is to really influence legislation, to make sure that the laws that we already have are enforced and passed, and we do a lot of training and support of the domestic violence programs who are supporting survivors in the local community.
Thank you, Lorian. And thank you both again for monitoring the questions that may be coming in today. She is a writer, an author, and comes to us from the City of Rochester's Mayor's Office of Communication. She has an exclusive voice in our community and is an amazing sister and friend, Maisha Beard Johnson. We want to thank you too for coming on with us today as well. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself, Maisha?
First of all, I'm so grateful to be in the company of so many amazing advocates. I'm just really grateful to be here. But a little bit of history about me is that I grew up in a household fueled with domestic violence. My father was an extreme batterer to my mother, and I would often try to save her and subsequently jump on my father or, stand toe to toe with the man that I adored, So with that, I have experienced lifelong traumas, I don't like to be yelled at. I don't like confrontation. If I hear people arguing, I'm like, oh no, it's fight or flight, so I have to still deal with those traumas at almost 50 years of age. But the beauty in it is that my father made amends. He dedicated the last over 30 years of his life as a domestic violence intervention specialist in California. My mother has forgiven him, and I promised both of them that I would continue this work. And so here I am.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that.
Good story. Thank you.
He is a licensed mental health counselor, a stand-up guy. Jack Brennan has been in our community for decades, being an advocate for domestic violence. I want to take the time to thank you, Jack, for coming on today. And can you tell us a little bit more about what you are involved with in the community and your experience?
Yeah, you just said a few things. I went to my first domestic violence intervention training. I was a fledgling school counselor, and I didn't want anything I had a reputation for being okay with teenage boys at this school. They would always tell these boys that were on their way to going to the principal or their superintendent or detention, go see Mr. B. And I always had a bottle of water and a chair. Sit down and drink this, something. But then I got approached by some women from a shelter, and I had never heard domestic or nothing. They had to drag me to this thing. And this is what I said to them. They said to me, well, you're pretty good with the boys. We got this. They were starting domestic violence intervention with violent men. And this is what I said to the two women that came to me offering that, we're going to take you to the training. We'll give you lunch, all this. I go, I'm good with boys. What do boys have to do with men? And, I kind of watch their eyes roll, and they're like, okay, you're a work in progress, Jack. Come with us. And I got the message to just keep showing up. I keep hearing more and learning more and listen. I got to listen hard. I got a lot of sisters who I think I learned to not listen. So then when I started realizing, like 6 siblings, 6 sisters, And they're like, oh, you never listen to us. So I had to shift some of that and to become a better listener, to hear women speak on this. So now I'm in a private practice. I'm no longer affiliated with an agency. The groups are shrinking in the country. These domestic violence intervention groups for men. There's not a good evidence base coming out of interventions. Like, we can't promise if 10 men go, 7 men will be cured. We don't have that, magic wand. And but I think it's still got to be talked about at whatever level I can do that. So thank you for inviting me, and I'm honored to be here.
Thank you for having the power and control wheel in the back. I can see it
Yeah.
from here.
Jack always brings that.
Okay. We also have, she's an assistant dean in financial aid at the Office of Monroe Community College. She's a community advocate, has been in the Latino community, providing advocacy and talking about her story for quite some time now, for a little over a decade. Her name is Sylvia Mendez, and I thank you, Sylvia, for coming on today and talking to us a little bit about your experience. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yep. Hi, everyone. My name is Sylvia Mendez. As Gina said, I'm the assistant director, maybe eventually the dean, absolutely, of MCC, the financial aid office. I've been at MCC for quite a while. I started back in 1998 and worked at MCC downtown for a few years, and then went to St. John Fisher College, and then I came back home, and I'm also an alumni. I am a domestic violence survivor. Growing up, I saw it, with my mom and my stepdad. My mom never really had a conversation with us about, what was happening, whether it was right or wrong, or none of that. And she moved us to Puerto Rico when I was younger. I was born in Rochester, and when I was 8 years old, my mom moved us to Puerto Rico, and I didn't fit in. I didn't want to be there. The thoughts of suicide also came into mind when I was around 13. I experienced some things that a 13 and a 14-year-old should have never experienced with a family member. And, I never understood as an adult, right, the repercussions that trauma had on me, when I became an adult. And then I was in a domestic violence relationship for 5 years. And my family did not know. The first time he ran me over with his car, pretty much. And the last time I almost died. And at that point, I have a daughter. I was married young, and I was married for 6 years, and I have a 27-year-old right now. And I didn't realize what that could have done to her. And at that moment, I was like, I have to get out of here. And it took me a long time to even admit that I'm a domestic violence survivor. I would never say it. I refused to say that I was a domestic violence survivor because I felt that also that meant that I was weak. I'm a very proud Puerto Rican woman, and it was like, no, that's weakness. And I ended up in the hospital for like 3 days, and that made me think about my feelings, and that made me kind of reevaluate that it's okay to say that I'm a domestic violence survivor, that I'm not weak, that I'm strong, because I'm not in that situation anymore. I'm alive. I'm here, and went back to school in my 30s and got my bachelor's, and went back to school 2 years ago and graduated with my master's in May of this year.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So I'm super proud of that. It was hard. I made that decision on a whim. A lot of times I tend to do that, but I'm so proud of where I started off and where I am today. And I feel that, I need to speak my truth. I know that it makes people uncomfortable. My family, there's a lot of things that still to this day don't know. There's things that my mom, I didn't share, not because I didn't trust her, but people always ask us, as a parent, I'm a mom and I want my daughter to tell me what's going on. And they ask, well, why don't you say something? Why didn't you talk to your family? The fear of the criticism, the fear of maybe them getting hurt it's always present, it's always there. Not knowing that if you reach out to the people that you love, that they will be there for you. You know, so it took a long time for me to kind of have, you know, that realization. And I'm proud to talk about it now, because if I could have one person and tell my story, then I feel that I'm fulfilled, that I've done my job. So that's a little bit about my story.
Thank you for sharing that. Again, congratulations on your degree this summer. I'm working on my master's now, so I know how difficult that can be. He is from East High School, and he's a licensed social worker and a pastor. He has been dedicated his career a long time for speaking up against domestic violence, whether it's in the community or in the church. I welcome Pastor Eddie Blanding. Thank you, sir, for being here today. I am honored to have you. Can you tell us a little bit more about the work you've done with domestic violence or with dating violence?
Well, just thinking about so many hats that I've been blessed to have. Well, as far as domestic violence, you know, I think it was brought to me. It was part of my destiny, because I was on a different journey, doing a lot of work with youth in the community, fighting for kids, going in schools, doing motivational talks, also on homicide scenes to try to calm people down and different things like that. And then one day I was in school getting my bachelor's. Speaking of MCC, I'll just say MCC saved my life, because I was a crackhead homeless bum, and people encouraged me to go back to school once I started getting my life together. Back then I went to MCC real fast, and I didn't even have a GED. I never made it to 10th grade. MCC at the time said if I can make at least a C for 2 semesters, they would give me my GED. And from that point, my life changed, and I ended up with a master's degree. So anyhow, moving from there, with my bachelor's, I started an internship. And during that internship, I ended up meeting this lady named Susan Steele. Many of you know Susan.
Yes, we know.
I was just ending my internship there, and I had at Hillside, and I had the privilege of working with her and her boys to help transition them into a new life beyond domestic violence as an intern. And so we still friends today. In fact, she just called me because her son's in a movie or two, Dane. So anyhow, I still communicate with her. And then I ended up meeting a guy, Vince Butler, from there. And so it was like destiny just kept me moving in that direction. And of course, Allie and Jack definitely helped lead me also, although they consider us working together, but I was taking a lot of pointers from them. So I still do somewhat of the work. I'm always fighting and advocating for the well-being of people. Also in the church, as well as I do adjunct professor work as well. And I'm always looking for wherever I can see those kind of issues and concerns going. And also to take back, just so I remember Jack saying it was always hard, even years ago back then, to really measure whether recidivism was happening or if men were getting better or not. But I'll say what we ought to, if we can't measure nothing else, just measure if women are still reporting being battered and suffering through things on the power and control wheel, the control side. If we can't measure the men, we can still measure the women still having issues. So I'll stop with that and just say I'm just honored to be here with everybody here. I appreciate the opportunity to share anything that I can, or any input I can add to the conversation. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. Before I introduce our last panel guest, I'm going to introduce my co-host right here, Annie. She's
Hello,
from
everybody.
Annie Lane Essentials, and she has been an advocate for so many years as well. We go to Albany all the time together to fight for laws. She has been instrumental in helping us with SAFER, survivors advocating for effective reform, and so many other things that she's done in our community. You want to say a little bit before I introduce the last person?
No, just thanks for including me in this. And I'm happy to be here. And I think this is great that we're putting this out there, and it'll be on YouTube for people to watch.
Well, guess what? You're going to be asking some questions. I'm just going to pass.
I'm happy to answer questions. Yeah.
Okay.
It's great to see you all here.
We have a special treat for you today. She has been a writer since she was a baby, since she can remember and learn how to write. She used to leave messages for her parents in the form of a poem or just a little scribble. all around the house. She started spoken word at an early age, at Writers and Books. She has performed here at Hochstein School of Music, Eastman School of Music, and has been featured on HBO for Slam High's team, Brave New Voices, a community activist, and continues to write and perform throughout Rochester. She was nominated 2019 for Best Female Poet of the Year, a survivor, and someone who I love to call my daughter, Khadijah Goddess Bliss. But shortly after she finishes, we will have Lorian Castell from the New York State Coalition of Domestic Violence, providing us with some information from New York State and stat information. Thank you. Thank you again, Khadijah, for being here. Miss Goddess Bliss is up next.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great meeting everybody. Together we are truly stronger. And this piece here that I'm gonna start off with, I got something prepared for you guys for later. I'm gonna start off with a piece called Can You Hear Me Now? I believe that we go through trying times and often we do feel like our voice is not quite being heard. Tell me, can my voice be heard? Meaningful like a lion's roar, straight like a bird, they'll soar. My words shoot firm and sharp like a sword. Assumed to be heard, but are they being absorbed, projected, loud and proud, syllables ejected from my lips? I listen with the tips of my ears, but hear no sound. Am I being heard? To you, I speak my mind, words of wisdom way before my time. To you, I speak my soul, from my forehead to the soles of my feet. To you, I speak my heart. My words ring out with every single beat. I cry out with my eyes, but don't shed a tear. I scream with my mouth, though there's a smile stretched long from north to south. My feet are running, though I'm standing completely still. My head held high, but yet I still feel. My hands go numb, and yet I still feel. My head held high, but inside I feel down. And the question is, can you hear me now? I am speaking to you. Open your ears, eyes, brains, and hearts. Listen to our needs. Just a few seconds, and our relationship will feed. Stretch the welcome mat is all I ask for before you're quick to shut the door.
My goodness. Thank you so much for that. Am I being heard? It really resonates with me, and I'm certain it resonates for most survivors. So thank you. And I'm glad we're all here today, not just to give voice to the survivors who are on the panel, but to survivors all over the state and all over the country. I need to take a deep breath. That was very powerful. So thank you, everybody. But I just wanted to say, Gina has asked me to share with you some statistics that are New York based. And you would think that that would be an easy thing to answer, wouldn't you? To kind of start us off and just have a framework of, just how prevalent the problem of domestic violence is in our state. And so like all answers to any question around domestic violence, the answer seems to be it's complicated. And so I just wanted to back up a little bit and just talk about why we aren't entirely sure about the numbers. And so the World Health Organization, which is, an entity that we really trust, who comes up with the numbers globally, says that 1 in 3 women will be victimized in their lifetime. Here in the United States, the organization that really does the counting of all of that across the country is the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. And they've really come up with a way to ask the question that's become the gold standard for folks like us who do domestic violence. And they say it's 1 in 4 women who will be victimized in their lifetime. And for men, it's 1 in 7 men, although we're still not quite sure if that's a lifetime statistic, that there'll be 1 in 7 men will be victimized across their lifetime, because we still haven't asked the right questions. We haven't asked the right questions about gender identity and sexual orientation. We're not quite sure who people are being abused by and when in their lifetimes. So there's still a lot of work to do, even though we trust the CDC to be doing this. And my computer wants to restart right in the middle. I've taken care of that. So in terms of, and also in terms of folks who identify as trans or non-binary or gender non-conforming, we really don't have a grip on that at all. So the numbers are really all over the place. I do want to say that there are a lot of organizations that are trying to get a grip on that, including right here in New York, the Anti-Violence Project in New York City, which also does a lot of national work. They issue a report every year that is really illuminating about violence among LGBTQ folks. But we're still not quite sure. And there's this issue of underreporting. So we know that there's still a stigma about coming forward and saying that you're being hurt by somebody that says that they love you and asking for services. And so there's a lot of reasons why people don't disclose, that they don't tell anybody, and they're all valid reasons. And Sylvia, actually, you really illustrated that quite beautifully in your introduction. So we know that people don't disclose. We know that people often don't seek help. And the way that we sort of figure out what the numbers are is we have to take from a lot of different sources. So how many shelter beds are being used per year, both in communities and across the state? How many orders of protection are not just issued, because we know that every order of protection that is asked for doesn't always get honored. So how many orders of protection are requested? What are the arrest rates, domestic violence incident reports? It's really all over the place. So what are we to do with that? In New York State, the most recent data that we have, and I'll try to wrap this up quickly so we can get to the conversation that's more interesting. The Office of Children and Family Services issues a report to the governor and to the legislature every year. And the most recent that we have is 2018. So I can tell you that in 2018, statewide, there were 334,000 calls to domestic violence programs across the state. 334,000. 12,000 adults and children received services in shelter, which means that they accessed emergency shelter for however long that they did, whether it was 1 night or 30 days or 90 days. 39,000, more than 39,000 adults and children received services, and that's for people who did not come into shelter, but they received things like legal advocacy and court accompaniment, support group, counseling, all the things that domestic violence programs do. And here's what hurts the heart. Close to 12,000 children were denied shelter in 2018, also for a wide variety of reasons. And more than 12,000 adults were denied shelter. So we don't have 2019 numbers yet, but we do know from efforts to do a one-day census. It's something that all the state coalitions partner with our national network to end domestic violence do. So every year we pick one day and we count the number of hotline calls that we get, how many requests for services we get. And in one day, we had 6,000 calls to New York State programs for services. So we have, for the past several years, had the highest demand for services in the entire country. One of the other things that Gina has asked me to do is to talk a little bit about the pandemic. So I'll just say that we know that the numbers in 2020, due to the pandemic and the fact that shelter programs have had to hold beds in order to shelter people with socially distanced protocol, we know that there will be a lot more requests that were denied for shelter. And it may be several months and maybe even several years before we're going to really know the full extent of the effects that COVID has had on domestic violence. So far, we know that programs all across New York State reported an uptick in domestic violence calls. But for those who did not experience that uptick, it's widely believed that it's because people were at home, sheltering in place with the person who was hurting them, and they were not able to reach out for help. So that's something, like I said, it's likely going to be several months and maybe even a year before we really understand the impact that COVID has had on the ability of survivors to access resources and help. So that's really what we've got in terms of New York State. Just to think about 334,000 calls in a year is a little bit overwhelming. And I guess the thing that I would sum up and just leave you with is that New York really does have the highest demand for services, not always granted. We don't always have the resources to provide, what people need. So we're still quite underfunded, quite under-resourced, and it's a huge problem. So thank you, Gina, for asking me to kind of set that framework.
Thank you for doing that. Then knowing those numbers, and those were some really big numbers in there. What type of resources are available in our community to be able to help others, Jack?
Are you asking me that question?
Well, you can answer it, and then I also would like Jack to can you do it for the New York State, and then Jack do it for the for Rochester?
Okay.
That'd be great. Yeah. Well, so one of the things that I want to say for anybody who's who might be watching this, who is across the state or even across the country, domestic violence programs exist in every single state. And we're lucky to have at least one domestic violence program in every single county. Somebody is providing domestic violence services. And what I'll do is I'll put in the chat box the New York State hotline number. So if people need to access domestic violence program services anywhere in the state, they can call that number. My organization, the New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, has a list. You can go online and there's a list of program by county. And SUNY also has a website where you could search for a domestic violence or a sexual assault program by zip code. And of course, I need to do a shout out here because I live in Rochester. This is my community. I'm very committed. I never get to work here. But I'm a big fan of the domestic violence programs that do exist here. Willow, of course, is a 24/7 domestic violence program and shelter. And there's also Resolve, which Ali and Jack could speak to as well. And we have some sexual assault programs also who do some fantastic work. So I'll just stop there. Thank you.
So Gina, the question was more about services in Rochester, or?
Any
Okay.
services that could be helpful to anyone dealing with this, especially with the alarming numbers that she just indicated, either in Rochester or any 800 numbers, that anybody could just call and get that information.
Yeah, no, I mean, the big ones have just been mentioned in terms of, Willow and Resolve are the big ones. I mean, even when I get calls too, to my, now I'm in a private practice. I was working with an agency that slowly started shrinking intervention classes for men. These ones that were, connected to this, that Duluth and the equality wheel and all that stuff. And it just, position people under resourced, not supported, and combined with that evidence-based phenomena, the direct services for offenders has been diminishing. There is a bunch of trained instructors spattered throughout the agencies, primarily because of Vince Butler. He trained a whole lot of people, and so those workers are still out there. Gina, yeah, those people are still out there. So organized. So if somebody says something about, usually, it's sort of like men or women, and or families. I'm always funneling them toward the two main places, Willow and Resolve. If somebody wants to get specific about intervening with guys, I'll have more conversation with them about that. I'm doing some of that out of my private practice. I hear a little bit about various different programs around town, but I can never nail down who's doing it. The Domestic Violence Consortium is another, the Monroe County Domestic Violence Consortium is another good clearinghouse for information as to where to send people, because that's a collection of agencies that meet for the very specific purpose of answering these type of questions. Now, the consortium as a group meets 4 times a year. It used to meet monthly, and now it meets 4 times a year. There's subcommittees involved with the domestic violence consortium, especially the Criminal Justice Committee. There's still a very large need for backup from the legal system. I mean, finally, well, it took a bunch of years. When I first got involved in this, like in 1989, there was very few laws. It somehow was relegated to marital strife, or they have to figure it out. And finally, some people started piecing it together. While assault is assault, there was almost more consequences if it happened against a stranger than if it happened in a family environment. Stereotype of the husband being the offender and going after the wife, and she's kind of, a little bit like Sylvia was hinting and talking about. So there's still a real big shortage of intervention, especially for men. But
so what you're saying is that we still have a lot of work to do, and there's still programs that they need to be implemented.
We still need to come to the table and have these conversations.
Does anybody else know of any other agencies that are available in the community?
I can add one other resource that's kind of newer to the continuum in upstate New York. The Open Door Mission has recently started a women and children's program over on Coldwater Road. And that program will also work with women and children who have been displaced specifically due to domestic violence. So that resource is a broader, it's primarily geared toward homeless population, but they also are supporting the needs of domestic violence victims and survivors. I know that the YWCA also has some ancillary supports for victims of domestic violence. So those are 2 other resources to consider. I would like to add to one thing that Jack just mentioned about the Domestic Violence Consortium. In Monroe County, we have 50 agencies roughly that are engaged in one way or another to address domestic violence. That includes law enforcement partners. And within that group, we have a subcommittee who's looking at how are we going to address the batterer side of the equation, because as Jack alluded to, the primary provider of, the primary provider of batterer intervention programs in the U.S. In Rochester has recently lost funding and has disbanded. So we are currently missing that piece entirely in our community and have a group looking at that. We're working very closely with probation and trying to come up with a new strategy for our community to address the offenders. And I can talk about this a little bit more later, but one of my biggest concerns about the work that's being done anywhere in the United States particularly is that we've done everything we can do to focus on meeting the needs of victims and survivors, which we absolutely have to do. We have a moral obligation to do that. But if we don't start paying attention to what do we do about offenders, we're never going to have any change to this issue. And the challenges in our community are felt kind of across the country. So it's not just that it's happening here. It is a national challenge. And several of us on this panel really feel very strongly about taking a more preventative focus to the issue of domestic violence. And that's not just about teaching kids how not to be abused when they become adults. It's about teaching people not to be abusive and knowing how to respond to those who make bad choices as adults or even as young people that are abusive or controlling toward their partner. So I hope we'll get a chance to talk about that a little bit more later. But it is an absolutely missing piece, and we have to do something about it.
May I say something
You
about
sure
that?
can. That was actually,
I would like to be a part of doing something about that. My father, who I mentioned, he actually had the #1 domestic violence intervention program in the country in California. He has since had a stroke. However, he rehabilitated over 10,000 offenders who didn't come back and reoffend.
That's great.
So his formula, it was called the Merit Program. I have a link of that, and I'll try to send it in here somehow. But the
Yeah.
template, he created the curriculum, and it worked. It
awesome.
worked. I'm talking about for, violent offenders, extreme batterers.
That's
So,
great.
That's an amazing thing to say.
yeah.
Maisha, while I have you on, you discussed a couple of things about trauma. How does trauma affect you today? And what do you think are some services that is needed for people who are facing trauma?
Can you say the first part one more time?
How has trauma continued to affect you today?
Mm.
And what are some programs you think that we should have to discuss trauma?
So trauma definitely still affects me today, and it affects me in my relationships. So when I was younger, um, my shoulders were always up. I was always tense. I was always having anxiety, always watching the clock to figure out when my dad was going to come home, because I knew when he would come home, it would be trouble.
Mhm.
So my trauma manifests in my relationships with men, right? Um, if a man raises their voice, it doesn't even have to be directed towards me. I go into straight fight or flight mode because I'm immediately reminded of that anger that my father and that rage that my father used to have. If I think that I've disappointed someone, I'm having anxiety because it goes back, to not being good enough when I was younger, when my dad was on drugs and being violent. So a lot of it manifests in a lot of ways. And I think that one of the things that needs to happen is we need to begin to focus also on the children. When my mother was recovering, nobody asked us how we felt. Nobody told us that we needed counseling. Nobody ever took me to get, the help that I needed because I was traumatized because I had to fight my dad in order to save my mom. It was all about my mom. And then it was all about my dad making amends. And where did me and my siblings fit in there? So I think that there definitely needs to be some therapy and some counseling for the children so that when they grow up and become almost 50 like me, they have a head start on finding tools to cope with various triggers. And noise, that's another thing, another trauma, noise. I don't like noise.
Hmm.
So.
Sylvia, anything you want to add to that in any kind of way? Because I know you mentioned you are a survivor and I heard your conversation earlier. Is there anything that you would like to add to that?
I think, like Maisha said, we think that, my daughter was younger, she was probably 10 when I got into the relationship, that was toxic and abusive. And she was always in her room. And in the back of my mind, whenever we had those fights, she didn't hear it. She was sleeping. But I never took the time to really talk to her about how she felt, right? My mother has always been a hero to me, and she's an amazing woman. She raised us alone, moved us to Puerto Rico. She went back to school and did all these things. But, there was a taboo about talking about problems. No one talked to me about even going to counseling either, as I was growing older and just trying to figure where I fit in, in the world. I was in a few toxic relationship as well, because, my stepfather, his father was abusive to his mom. So if you think about the repercussions that it caused, and I hear this all the time when I talk to parents or even moms of those domestic violence survivors, and they always say, but why didn't they come to me? And I had to think about that. It's taken all this time to think about that and say, like, yeah, and even my sister, I know that if my sister would have known, it would have been a big problem.
Mm-hmm.
It would have been a big problem, right? Because she protects me, and she's my little sister, but she protects me. But I didn't, because I wasn't sure if I was going to leave. I always doubted that. I wanted to leave. I wasn't sure. I was still working and I wasn't completely dependent on him, but I was older and I was like, I have a child and how I'm going to maneuver and how I'm going to do this. And, oh my God, I'm another failed relationship, because, a lot of times we get into these relationships and we are afraid to leave because, oh my God, another failed relationship. So, I think we have to be aware that our kids do hear us. Even if we think they're sleeping, they're not. They're listening, and we don't talk to them about, no, this is not the behavior that you should put up with, and have them tell you how they feel. So I do agree with that. I think that goes for both, a boy that sees his father, right, doing that to his mom, and a girl that sees his mom being abused by their parent or step parent or even someone else. It's important to start that work when they're young.
Hi, I just want to add, I really appreciate that perspective, both from Sylvia and Maisha. It brings to mind a conversation that I often have with some of the folks that I know well on this panel and spend a lot of time thinking about. I actually prefer to refer to domestic violence as family violence because it is an intergenerational cycle of violence, and children, whether or not they are in the direct line of the abuse, as Maisha described in her example of trying to be the person who intervenes, or if I was sexually assaulted by my father who was abusing my mother. So the ways that violence manifests for the kids has often been largely overlooked. I know in our community we are trying to do a better job of that, and there are programs, but they're not always offered and they're not always accessible. And when Lorian was talking earlier about the statistics and how challenging it is to actually come up with statistics around this work, we need to understand, and we know in the statistics when you dig down on them, that the number of people that are reporting abuse are largely people who have prior exposure to abuse. So whether that was childhood or they were sexually assaulted in their teenage years and then ended up marrying into an abusive or violent relationship, these things are so intertwined. And when we try to treat and address domestic violence by looking at it as a point of time experience, as an incident that prompts a law enforcement response that prompts additional action, we miss the vast majority of domestic violence and people are left suffering. So I think that we really have come to a point in this work, not just locally, but nationally, even internationally, where our definitions of what domestic violence is need to be expanded and accepted. That this is a much larger problem than what we understood it to be in the 1960s when we said men are beating up women. So it really is time for us to take a bigger look at this problem.
Thank you for saying that. Lorian, you had another thing to say?
Very briefly, just to build on all of that, because I wanted to sort of offer a ray of hope and build on what Ali is saying. I know for sure from my position as the Director of Prevention here in New York, that the domestic violence programs today understand that trauma that goes unaddressed bubbles up in adulthood. And so there's a variety of ways that they are now not only creating a trauma conscious environment for their shelters and their programming, but they're also saying to moms, you know, clearly you've been traumatized. Let me talk to you about what trauma does to the brain and to the body. And, you know, let's, you know, connect you with people who can help you sort through all of that. But also, did you know that it affects children in this way? And if you're interested in more information, we can talk about that. And not in a victim blaming way, look at what you allowed your children to witness or be exposed to, but in a, you know, if we address it now, it could sort of resolve things that are gonna could be lifelong problems in terms of health and wellness, mental wellness, emotional intelligence, you know, but also just trauma makes us sick. Right. So the other thing that I just wanted to say is it really is all about promoting healthy relationships. So we know that we're doing that in domestic violence work all over the country. And as Ali said, all over the world. But we're also we're starting early. And, you know, one of the things that NISCATIV is doing, my organization is doing, is we've had legislation in front of a wide variety of legislators for 15 years that would mandate that schools also teach about healthy relationships, kindergarten through 12th grade, that are not just about identifying unhealthy, dangerous behaviors, but, you know, not just the red flags, but what are the green flags? What does a healthy relationship look like? Because we don't have a lot of models of that. Right. And so I think that that's really, that's exciting to me. And I just offer that as sort of a ray of hope that there are people all over the country who are working on this, and they know that services and supports have not been adequate up until now.
Thank you for that. Speaking of children, I know, Eddie, that you work in the schools and you work with children every day, or youth every day, I should say, because you're at East High School. Have you seen a huge increase in dating violence? How do you approach dating violence in the schools, especially now that she's saying they need to go back, you know, from kindergarten and up, teaching them about healthy relationships? I know I've called upon you, Ali, and Moses, who was unable to be here today, to come with me and do workshops in the schools. So what approach are you using in the schools, and have you seen anything?
Well, in terms of, you know, a couple of things was going through my head while I was listening to these awesome communications and conversations. And even the last thing Lauren said about looking for green and red flags. Always been a person who think that all potential abusers always show a green flag perspective until you invest time and energy, money, your life, have a kid, get a house together, et cetera, then those red flags show. I think if they showed the red flag from the beginning, we would know right away this ain't good for me. So it's after the investment. So I just want to mention that. Also, when you talk about children, we right now I'm working at East as a youth resilience, building groups for youth resilience, connected with the U of R. And that's really this trauma work. And when we look at trauma work, as also has been mentioned, and how that affects the brain. This thing about children is really, to me, very, 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 very overlooked and serious, as been stated, because it also affects it's hard for me to think about social studies and math, et cetera, when I got to worry what I'm going to be faced with when I go home. And then also, when you look at them becoming victims as well as victimizing, or ended up in a justice system, and all that stuff is all interconnected. As Ali said, is way bigger than we given it credit for. The way we address it also, we do, ACE screening, and many people heard about ACE screening, is really looking at trauma in your past or current trauma. And when you talk about dating violence, there's a lot of different layers of that too, that we have to talk about, because some men or young men use an excuse, she hit me first. And so we have to also talk about that and address that issue as well. And so, and also letting them know that one of the first things we've done, even since Zoom, is identifying a trusted adult, right? So, somebody that I can go to no matter what's going on. If I can't tell it to my teacher or in the whole class, find somebody that you learn to get comfortable with to be able to tell what you're going through. That's another way that we do that. And also, when you talk about the men, it's not just, it's not just working on the battery. That thing is also an accountability issue. You know what I mean? To hold them accountable for this behavior and these things. And so I have so many things going through my head right now. I'm trying to stick with the children, but also, the family violence piece that Ali also mentioned is definitely something that I look at. And I think that the reason we have so many different struggles with addressing numbers and addressing good ways and good plans is because, and this might be off the cuff, but sometimes when the predominance is a patriarchal society, that the predominance of the statistics is patriarchal, is a male perspective thing. And from that perspective, you can see funding being affected. You can see outcomes being affected. And you can see the good old boy behavior even now more than ever coming back to focus. And we need to really be concerned with that, because the good old boys behavior is coming back into focus in America today. And so we need to figure out and stay on top of those things. And what I mean by that is we see it where things are happening now and we just shuffle it under the rug and don't really take care of accountability. Well, back in the schools, I've been really concerned because I was working with students who have been in traumatic event, witnessing. I always say, if you witness abuse, you are being abused. And so I think with children, that I was real worried that with COVID, speaking of COVID-19, that, there's kids I was worried about that I know was already challenging situations. Now they're forced to be stuck in this situation for hours upon hours. Also, I was concerned with students who, in environments where alcoholism has increased since COVID-19, also where outlets for people to let out their frustration in other ways, like bars and football games and basketball games, et cetera, has been shut down. And so we're in these four corners. And someone else mentioned earlier, they can't even reach out because they can't go to another place to reach out. And so, but yeah, I think we address it in a lot of different generic ways. I don't think we have a real specific program that I know of. One thing that's good about East, I guess, is we have so many resources that the average city school don't have. And so we have a little more than that. So we have a lot of programs in a lot of different ways to get kids in programs, even if it took to a place that a couple of those programs parents may not even know about, to get a kid what they need if they're scared to talk about it because they're worried about what's going to go on in the household. We are able to start some of that restorative work and healing work even without a parent's consent in some cases. And so we, again, East has so many different programs. And I'm going to stop there until you ask me something else, because I don't want to go on and on.
I do. I have another one later. I'm going to ask Lorian and Maisha this question. I will start with Lorian and then go to Maisha. What is trauma informed when it comes up to domestic violence? And then I know, Maisha, that I heard of you talking about it in the school setting at college at Brockport about this as well. So as soon as she finished, can you just chime right in and talk about what you did and the work that you did over there at Brockport? Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, hold on, you're muted.
Oh, no.
There you go, sorry.
Yeah, so I was just going to say that's like such a big topic, and it's we could talk about it for a day, but I'll try to be really really brief. So I would say that to provide the way we look at it, to provide trauma informed services is to be conscious of the trauma that not everybody who comes to our services may be experiencing trauma, but we have to make an assumption that most people are. So if we operate with the assumption that everybody, a survivor or their children, is walking in carrying trauma, that we're going to be a certain way with them. And so, gosh, Maisha, you were the one who said something about noise, right? Like noise, it can be very triggering. So it might be something, I think if I gave you some examples of what a trauma-informed environment looked like or trauma-informed services, it might cut to the chase rather than being really clinical. It might be just understanding that somebody in your shelter their trauma could be activated by even hearing the sound of children playing on the playground outside, right? Which might be a really joyful sound to most people, but the cacophony, the chaos of the sound could be very activating for somebody who has experienced trauma and hasn't had the opportunity to work through it. Even gentle music might be that way. The color of a wall, the way somebody smells. Somebody might have a traumatic response to a counselor who's, really great, somebody that we employ that we think is a great counselor advocate, but there's just something about them that reminds the survivor of something that is not good. So it's just really being super attentive to what survivors need and making sure that we're paying attention, right? We're paying attention, we're in communication with them all of the time. We're creating an environment as best we can, again, to do no harm. So we used to talk about being survivor-centered and letting the survivor sort of drive the bus of the kinds of services that they got. And we talked about an empowerment model. We wanted everyone to feel empowered. And that's really, so that's 20-year-old language that's really been replaced by this language of being trauma conscious or trauma informed. And it really does have to do with, it's a way of being, and it's creating an environment and a way of being with survivors that's not directive. And making sure that if they need, more help than even our programs can give them, that we're connecting them with people who specialize in trauma, and that they understand that it's normal, that trauma is a normal response to abnormal situations. When our senses and our beings get overloaded and overwhelmed, it could be from a disaster, an earthquake, it could be from, a variety of things that might happen to a person. Domestic violence is one of those things that can create trauma. As I said, if it's not resolved, it can find a way to bubble up.
Maisha, do you want to?
So Gina, can you go back? You said of what I did at Brockport?
Yes, I think you did like a trauma-informed domestic violence workshop. Am I wrong?
I don't remember doing that at Brockport. But I did do it. I did speak. I had several speaking engagements on domestic violence, and I did talk about trauma bonding.
Yes, that's what I'm talking about.
Okay, so I did talk about trauma bonding, and what I talked about to the ladies was the fact that, people on the outside, they think it's easy to leave. But when you have someone abuse you, and then they come back with flowers and they tell you that they love you and they're sorry and they're wiping your tears and they're kissing your forehead and they're saying they'll never do it again and please don't leave me, right? That is addictive. Then it happens again. Then they come back again and apologize. And so it's this continuous cycle, and it's trauma bonding, which makes it so difficult sometimes to leave. It's something that my father taught me, and that's something that my mother agreed. Yeah, it was hard to leave because this is my mother. My mother is saying, when I got married forever. I meant my vows, you know? So no, I didn't want to fail. I didn't want to fail marriage. And then your father would make me feel sorry for him. He would come back and say sorry. And then I say, okay. And then it'll happen again. And the only reason my mom got out is because my grandparents, my father's parents, took her.
Mhm.
So trauma bonding, I think, is so important to talk about. And I think it'll help other people understand how to better help someone who they're perceiving doesn't want to leave,
Mhm.
to understand what's happening with them psychologically. Does that make sense?
Yes, ma'am.
And so, sorry, that's one of the things that I really like to talk about a lot, to bring some awareness to that.
Jack, did you have anything to add to that before we go to the next question?
No. I was just compelled by the term. I don't know that I get what you're talking about, Maisha, but I was like, oh my gosh, new term that
Yeah.
that I need to just know a little more about.
Okay.
I've seen the pattern, but
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
it's a pattern. And you know, one of the common denominators of that pattern is, it's like, so you have a child, right? I don't spank. I'm not a spanker. But you have a child and the parent spanks that child. And the first thing that child does is run to hug the parent. You know, but I still love you. Why are you, hurting me? So I think about it in that way. Even though
yeah,
my father was abusing my mother, she still loved him,
Mm-hmm.
right.
you know? And that's all a part of that bond and that difficulty, how difficult it is to leave.
Yeah, that's also that investment piece I was talking about.
Yes.
After you have the kid and love and marriage and all that other stuff. Also, I want to mention Lauren also said about many different things can trigger. When I first met Susan Steele, she almost fainted. She had this gasping for breath moment. And so she asked to talk to me. I just want to say real quick at the door. And she said that I looked like her abuser. And I also had my beard and mustache cut the exact same way. So I almost didn't begin that work with her until we had a conversation. And then I really just worked with the boys for a good segment at a time before doing the whole family work. But yeah, you wouldn't have known. I just came in and it was regular work, business as usual. But I was a male, I looked like him, and I had my beard cut like him. She was scared at first, but we worked through it.
Thank you for sharing that. Sylvia, were the services readily available for you? Did you know of the services when you were and did you know of any services when you were dealing with domestic violence?
I'm sure there was services available for me when I was experiencing the domestic violence. I can't, when I think back now, I can't remember if I knew of any, because I really didn't talk to a lot of people. I didn't talk to my coworkers, because sometimes what happens is when you hear people talk about domestic violence, a woman that has never been in that situation, they don't understand. And they kind of judge you. They look at you like, well, why don't you just leave? Well, if it was that easy, I would have been gone a long time. I wouldn't have stayed this long. They think that it's about the money, or it's so much more than that. It's not, some depend on that significant other to support them. And if you have, 2, 3, 4 kids, or and you don't know what you're going to do, where you're going to go, that's one aspect of it. It's not just so simple. And I think people think it's so simple. Then why didn't you leave? And then if you say that you were in it, they look at you like, they don't understand why you put up with it. So I don't remember knowing about the resources. I think that if I knew, of the resources. If maybe I knew more people that were experiencing that or had those conversations, maybe I would have opened up and talked to someone, because then I would have felt like, wow, I could relate to what I'm going through. You know, a lot of times we look for that. We look for people that kind of look like us, first of all, right? Because at MCC, we talk about that all the time with our students. Can a student relate to me, right? And if they can't, they don't open up. So, you know, if there's someone that I can relate to and talk to, I think, I can't remember if I knew of the services, you know, how we have these numbers that you can call and the shelters. And I think I was just afraid to reach out.
Well, thank you for answering that. And also you hit another important question that I just was going to ask. And I also would like to ask it to Allie. Why do people stay in an abusive relationship, Allie?
Well, we've touched on a couple of those examples. Like the dynamics of trauma bonding are very, very real. And if that term seems a little distant, I think Maisha did a good job describing it. But two things I'd like to say. One is, you know, most people who enter into or find themselves in an intimate partner violence situation went into that relationship with the best of intentions, right? They cared for that person and they believed that that person cared for them. When you are observing your partner harming you, oftentimes, many years ago, there was a book written called Women Who Love Too Much. You know, we recognize in our abusive partners or our violent partners their inherent brokenness, right? And we often feel a huge sense of responsibility for that person, that if we are the, you know, we're the glue that holds them together and they're losing it right now, but they're only taking it out on me, right? And what happens to them if I'm not in their life anymore? So sometimes, not always, but sometimes those dynamics are present and they're very, very powerful. Sometimes the abusive partner says, if you try to leave me, I'll kill myself. That's an incredibly powerful way to manipulate someone and keep them in the relationship, even if they're still harming you. And that harm, I also think it's really important. We've heard a little bit about physical violence tonight, but to think about intimate partner violence again only through that lens of physical battery or sexual assault it's a very minimal lens to see it through. The dynamics of power and control, the crazy making, emotional and psychological abuse. Our colleague Vince Butler, who has been mentioned several times on the call tonight, used to talk about the idea of denial and blame being kind of the national pastime. You know, we all do it. It's in our human nature to deny or blame other people for bad things that happen to us at different times in our lives, or to minimize how bad something is. Well, abusive people, men or women, are masterful at that. And so you feel turned around all the time. You feel like you're going crazy when you live with someone who just told you something. Or here's an easy example. Last week I made a dinner for you that you really loved. It was a new recipe and you really liked it. This week I make the same thing and you throw it across the room. I made it exactly the same way. I did what I thought made you happy, and I didn't, and I don't know why. I can't. It's really hard to reconcile that kind of thing when you're in love with someone, or you think you're in love with someone who, frankly, isn't in love with themselves, and so they can't love you. You know, most offenders are little boys walking around in big boy bodies. There are certainly offenders who are just kind of born that way, but it's a very small number. The vast majority of offenders have histories of their own that have taught them how to behave, that have influenced how they exist in the world. And victims know that. And that's part of what hooks us into that relationship with them. It's part of what makes us stay, is that we want them, we know their good parts, and we want to bring that out in them, and we think we have this magical power to do it. And it's really magical, because we don't. Nobody can do that for somebody else who's not invested in stepping into their wholeness. So
Speaking of yeah, relationships and people being victimized. Jack, there's a misconception that this is only happening to women. There's always using she. And there's many other people in our community and people that we see every day that face domestic violence. Can you get into how men in the LGBT community face this?
I can remember one time having a man come to me. I couldn't really tell gay, not gay, or whatever. And but the report said his partner and beat him up. So I was picking this up. I call a probation officer. I go, we only got, this is man on women. He said, well, I don't know. The guy said he wanted to come. So I'm having a conversation with him, and I'm going through that wheel and we're talking about it, and he wants to sign up for the program. And I go, well, I got to tell you, this is to this offender. I said, I got to tell you, the men in this group, they're kind of homophobic. They're not exactly. So maybe, I had to think about the way I was even talking, instead of using her, him, just your partner. How about that? I had to change a few pronouns. But I said, there's a lot of homophobia in this group. You're saying you want to do this. He was really had a willingness. He never been in trouble like that, didn't realize what he was doing would bring on the cops and a whole big response. And then, his experience with the police was a whole other thing when they saw it was two guys. The police are like, I mean, they were respectful enough, but they really didn't, they kind of didn't quite have it together. Well, the rest the bigger ones. So that's how, I don't know. But I told him, there's a lot of homophobia in this group. This is when we were doing the groups. And he said, you mean more than in regular society? And I was like, oh, well, probably not, I guess, and so I get educated along when it comes to really speaking to the LGBT community. I don't really have much communication with women at all in same-sex violence or intimate partner violence between same sex when it's women. And a lot of times I'm funneling that off to the shelter. There will be times when men who are named as the primary aggressor, and then in the process of having them in a classroom for a lot of weeks, they'll talk a little bit about what happened. And it was probably 15 years ago when I realized that truth about little boys and big bodies, big men's bodies, and Vince Butler was the one that said, instead of saying what's wrong with you, start asking what happened to you. And that's where the ACEs study started coming into play with my thinking about this. But there's a whole, Eddie was talking about the patriarchal response, and you don't call the police. You don't call the police on your wife. And these guys, well, she did this, she did that. She should have got took away. And they say all these things that, and I'm going, well, if it was that bad, how come you didn't call the police? Well, you can't call the police. And then talking about an uneven police response. And a lot of times, here I am hearing this from, sometimes it's dubious sources, or maybe they're trying to do that minimization, denial, and blame thing, put themselves in a positive light. So it's Lorian, earlier you said it's complex. Well, now I understand it's more complex than I could even coherently explain after being at it for 30 plus years. You think I'd be able to speak like a Harvard professor, and I still stumble over what do I want to say next about this, because that's complicated. Anyway.
Lorian, did you want to add something to that?
I did, just very briefly, because I think, Jack, there's no learning curve that you sort of get to the top of and you're like, I know what I need to know now to do this job well. We just keep learning every day. I just wanted to say that even though I said it's really hard to get a grip on LGBT, the rate of intimate partner violence among LGBTQ folks, the evidence indicates that it happens at the same rate as in heterosexual relationships. And maybe even higher. But again, the common wisdom is that we have to believe that that's underreported as well because of not outing, right? Not wanting to call the police, in the same way that communities of color don't always call the police because they don't see the police as being helpers. The LGBTQ community also feels, and Jack, you did mention this, the way the system responded is a whole other thing. So there's so many valid reasons why people don't call the police or why they don't disclose. But we've heard from many people who do disclose in the LGBTQ community that they won't call the police because they don't want to out their partners, or they don't want for people to think that they have more violence in that community than they do. And so, it's just another kind of layer on, the kind of the stigma that everybody feels in terms of reaching out.
We have a lot of work to do. Eddie, I know you said you wear a lot of hats, so I'm going to ask for your pastoral hat right now. Do you feel that we talk about this enough in the churches and congregations? Do you talk about it in October, or do you talk about it in your church more than just October?
Well, most of my preaching work now is Facebook Live as well as in the streets, but I'm a leader at New Life Fellowship. But I've always had an issue with how domestic violence was addressed or not addressed in the church. And what I would have to say is that domestic violence in the church, is more addressed through generic forms, like not calling out a specific sin, so to speak. In other words, they're saying like, oh, love your wife like Christ loved the church, something like that. And then is left to interpretation. Well, Christ forgives and he loves the church. He nurtures the church. He's there for the church, et cetera, et cetera. So from those generic forms, where I used to be more fearful of is scriptures like what God joins together, let no man put asunder, or only divorce for this reason and that reason. And so it was leaving people with the belief that I can't never leave this man because the scripture says not so. Okay. And so I was more fearful of that than how I thought we addressed it or not. Do I think we addressed it specifically? No, I think the church still today, other than if somebody come in October, but the church still today, I believe, at least from my experience, really only address those type of issues, or just like a generic issue of anything else that anybody might be struggling with. Like they don't have a day where they particularly deal with alcoholism, or they don't have a particular day that they deal with if somebody's gang banging or whatever. They just talk about the good, and it's just wrong to do wrong. And so again, there's those other things that goes unaddressed when you're stuck in relationship and is based on some spiritual or scriptural perspective. That has to be addressed. And that doesn't get addressed in the church. So from a spiritual perspective, I think that's what we have to be more careful about.
Allie, I know you do a lot of work in the churches. So what other steps can we take to help get a message through in the congregations or find healing for victims in the church?
Well, it's the faith community is another one of those kind of, when we talk about a coordinated community response to domestic violence, it needs to also include the faith community, the medical community, as well as law enforcement and advocacy groups and the places where we already are primarily. But some of the things that churches can do, there are some very practical steps that churches can take. First of all, churches can make information available within the church for if you're struggling in your relationship, here are places you can turn. Here are people that you can talk to. Pastors, I really believe, need to be trained to understand that parishioners may come to them with what they consider to be marital strife, and that the pastor really has to do a good job of figuring out if the abusive partner in that relationship isn't also now trying to use their faith as a weapon against their other partner. Very often, particularly abusive men who are profoundly rooted in their faith will come to their pastoral leadership for counseling and give all this evidence as to why their wife is not living up to her responsibilities in faith. And that's a tactic. So the pastor has to be careful not to just automatically align with the person who's levying the complaint against their partner, and be thoughtful about counseling them separately, encouraging both partners to be able to speak truthfully and acknowledge that if there is an abuse dynamic in this relationship, one partner isn't free to speak in front of that pastor about what's happening at home, because it could be dangerous to them. So there are some practical things like that that can be done. Churches can intentionally speak to the issue of domestic violence. They can look for scripture, and I'm not as quite as astute as you or Eddie around, pulling scripture, but I have lots of notes. But there are many examples in the Bible that speak to the importance of marriage, not from the perspective of headship, not from the perspective that the man must dominate the household. And we need that to become more of standard scripture that reinforces the importance of both partners in a marriage. Because too often the old standbys are used, and they are very patriarchal in their approach. So the church needs to be a safe haven. It also really, very importantly, my last thought on this is, in our churches, it's one of the few places in society where we are still seen in the context of a family. So you walk into church and I know who mom, dad, and the children are. And I know that they go together. And so if your church has an active youth program and children are involved in the youth program, they are a critical safety net to kids who may be struggling, because when they're in church together, they are on their best behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody comes to church with their warts showing. They all come to church looking their best, wanting everybody to think the best of them. And so the environment can lend itself to people not being able to be true to themselves. And so we need churches to recognize the importance of their role in supporting families and the health of the relationships in those families.
Yeah,
Thank
I
you
like
for
that. I like this one to add real fast. I like the fact of that they can be a resource and share that information. That was powerful, as well as I thought about another scripture that's used too, is wives submit to your husbands.
Mm-hmm.
That's another one where that gets used a lot too. But I also know that I've seen divorce end up being a situation that happens in church. And so that does happen when things are brought to the pastor and they can't seem to reconcile those things. And some people divorce and end up separating in churches, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I had something else, but it kind of slipped my mind right now, so I won't try to force it out. But yeah, those are some good things there.
That comment, Eddie, about the when divorce happens in a church, that can be really hard for a church community, because one member of that family may choose not to come to that church anymore, and the church wants to believe they're big enough to hold that family, and they may or they may not be. But at the end of the day, if you care about the family and one partner chooses to find support in a new faith community, kind of the best thing we can do for them is to support them in that and have them not feel like they don't belong anywhere. Let them find a new place where they feel like they do belong. But it's difficult sometimes in that cohesiveness of a faith community to see a family fall apart. It can be really hard, and rumors can circulate. And so talking to pastors about, when a couple comes to you, you have to keep information close to you. Don't support the rumor mill, So
Yeah.
churches are a little bit complicated, but they're a place of immense support for people. And when we overlook that, we can make it much harder for survivors to find their way if they need their faith as an anchor.
Right.
Okay, I know we're just a little over 7 o'clock. I do have two more questions. My first one is something that is always asked in the community, and people, I would like to hear from a survivor's perspective, and I would also like to hear it from a counselor advocate's perspective. You have a family member dealing with domestic violence, okay? And you do not know how to approach the family member, or how do you help the family member that's dealing with domestic violence? And then for the survivor, how did you feel? Did you have to deal with that? And if you did, how did you feel about it?
When you asked the second part, Gina, in terms of how did you deal with it, what did you mean by that?
Well, was there a family member that saw this going on and came to you and said, this needs to stop? And what did you say? How did you go through?
I think at the moment, there's always people that notices certain patterns, right? For me, in my experience, in my situation, when he drank, that's when the ugly came out, you know, and other people saw it. They never saw him being abusive, you know, at all. They didn't see that part because I kind of hid that from them. But I lied, you know, when I have a scar on my hand, and that was the, you know, when I decided to leave, I lied. I said I fell, and then my hand went through a window. I cut 4 tendons. I had to have surgery. I was out of work for a month. My anxiety was awful. I used to wake up my daughter at 3 o'clock in the morning and tell her to pray for me because I thought I was going to lose my mind, you know, because I didn't know who else to ask for comfort. You know, I couldn't breathe. I mean, it was just, and I was still in that environment because I wasn't able to leave right away because I had just had surgery and I needed to go through all of this. So I think that some of the family members saw what was going on and tried to talk to me, but I kept avoiding the conversation, you know, and I would minimize what was happening. You know, the crazy part is that he was a fireman and he still is. And I know that's, you know, I don't really say that often, but, you know, they saw certain patterns. I just didn't want to talk about it and minimize. So I think that's where if I knew that my family would be supportive, I knew that they will be there. I knew that, you know, I just didn't want to. At that point, like I said before, I thought I was being weak. So it was almost like, well, you got what you deserve because you're in this situation. You know, and obviously I don't think that way at all. But at that moment, I just didn't feel comfortable. I wanted to protect me, my daughter, and to a certain extent him because of his reputation. So
Lorian, can you answer that from a advocate or a counseling perspective? What would you tell a family to a member to do in a situation like that when they can see domestic violence going on and want to help? What should they do?
And it's especially difficult if the person has not come to you for support and hasn't disclosed it, but it's something that you sort of see from the outside. You know, the recommendation that we make, and, you know, we get calls like this every single day from friends and family that say, you know, what should I do? And I think, so there are some guidelines that we set forth, which is, you know, one is not to tell people what to do. Like, for instance, you got to get out of there. You got to leave, right? Because, and I put it in the chat box, I think what people don't realize when they're not survivors themselves, or they don't know the nature and the dynamics, is we really, everyone in society thinks that leaving equals safety. And that's just not true. So we can't walk in somebody's shoes and say, you know, if you get out of this, you're going to be safe. Because in fact, every study that's ever been done on this actually indicates that it can actually escalate behaviors like stalking and physical assault and sexual assault at the moment of separation. And so we've really just got to be careful not to tell people what to do. And then the other thing to make sure that we do is not to give folks ultimatums. Like, if you don't leave, I'm out of here. I can't support you.
Oh, God, yes.
Right? We were just talking about, you know, faith communities, and that's one of the things that happens too is, right, well, if you leave, we're not going to support you. Friends and family often say, if you don't leave, I won't support you. So I think the advice and the guidance, the support that we give to somebody who's concerned is you just got to be there with them. You know, slip them the number for the local hotline. Let them know that help is available. Let them know that you see what they're going through and that you will be available to them. You know, just really wrapping them with sort of understanding. We live in a victim blaming society where we kind of, we turn the whole thing on its ear. Instead of saying, why don't they leave? We don't ask, well, why does the abuser abuse? Why are they using control and coercion?
Good question.
Well, let's do that. Let's ask that question instead of why do they put up with it and why don't they just leave? So the other thing to know is that we don't walk in a survivor's shoes. Somebody who's being victimized knows best what they need to do, and they do it in their own time, and they're always safety planning, right? They're always, and safety planning is fluid. It can change daily, it can change hourly. They're always scanning for safety. So we can't know better than they do what they need to do in order to stay and be safe.
And just to add to that, that one of the most crucial times for a person that is dealing with domestic violence is when they're transitioning out and then when they leave. I think that's a huge thing to make sure that people understand, because once you start leaving, it escalates on the other person and the abuser's behalf. There's a lot of information that we have hit today. And I would like to ask each one of you, starting with Maisha, what can we do to collaborate efforts and bring together our community together to be able to do some grassroots work?
I think that one of the first things we need to do is kind of diversify the collective with regards to domestic violence advocates. Like we have to begin to mirror the people who need help, you know, and in all spaces.
Right.
I think that's one of the main things, and so that way we can understand them not only you know, personally but culturally. You know, like the church culture, you know, like for me when I was younger and CPS was called, my dad slapped me in my face and I still had the thing in my eye. My eye got big, so I couldn't go to school, but I went to work with them and they called CPS on them. So when CPS came, I still love my dad. So I'm going to lie. And I'm going to say, no, I fell off my bike, you know, because I don't want my dad to get in trouble. So I'm going back to that thing where, you know, even though someone is abusive, it doesn't mean that the person doesn't love them. So don't start talking bad about the person, you know, the abuser. Just listen to the victim. So I think those two things, if we did more of that, I think we'll be in a better place.
Jack, same question. What can we do to collaborate efforts? I know you participate in the Father's Day pledge every year. And
Thanks to you.
and hopefully this year we're going to be making it, well, 2021, we're going to send it to New York. To Washington, but I know that you know of many other collaborative efforts. How can we come together and work together on this issue?
Well, one of the things I'm always wishing more of is men in positions of power standing up and going, you know, this is really a problem, because that might be some patriarchal move, but we all know how, you know, men in positions of power can sometimes make moves, and so moves in the direction of family safety. I got to keep listening. I just got to keep listening. I'm going to keep showing up at the table and keep hearing more from the experts, of the people who've been through it. I mean, I might know a lot of 30 years, and I grew up with some nutty men who taught me bad things, but you know, I just need to do plenty of listening and coach the men in my circle to listen to that way. and not discount it, not minimize, not deny. So
Okay, Lorian, I know that you got a nice little program going on, and how can we help and how can we collaborate with the fathers, and as well as any other program that you might want to share?
Yeah, well, first off, I just want to shout out to our local programs, Resolve and Willow. Have been doing some wonderful prevention activities really all along. They're designed to stop the violence before it begins. So, a lot of work with youth, a lot of work in the workplace. And so there's great stuff happening statewide and nationally. I know like domestic violence programs all across New York are doing incredible things around engaging men and engaging men and boys. Jack, you said earlier, what do boys have to do with domestic violence? But, nurturing youth leadership and getting youth to be sort of, leaders talking about healthy relationships and that sort of thing. There's tons and tons of programs that we're doing. We're a big fan of Coaching Boys into Men, which trains coaches to work with their male athletes in middle school and high school, all about sort of, leadership and, how to be not just a good person, not just to be strong on the field, but how to be a good person off the field. And we just launched an initiative called Because We're Dads, which is engaging fathers and male identified caregivers to, talk to their children about a variety of things, not just violence, because it really is connected to so many other issues. And that's why we can start early. We can talk to toddlers about consent in good touch, bad touch. And we can talk to kindergartners about how to be a good friend and a good listener. It doesn't have to wait until we're sending them off to college to talk about consent. So all of that is happening. And again, that feels like a ray of hope to me to be able to share that with you all, that there's we've learned a lot in the last 20 years about what will work with prevention.
Thank you. Sylvia, is there any way you can think of that we can collaborate efforts into, getting into our communities in any kind of way?
I think going back on, everybody touched on that a little bit, right? I grew up Christian Pentecostal, like old school Pentecostal. My grandfather was a pastor of a church, and then my uncle, and now my cousin, and educating the church, right? Like everyone talked about that too. For me, the way I felt like it was time for me to get involved was to just speak about my story. And because if I can encourage one other woman to speak about her story, then she'll speak it, it becomes a ripple effect. So I think that, some of the ways is, volunteering our time and trying to be involved and not being afraid to speak your story. Am I afraid sometimes? Yes. I feel like, I hope people don't look at me a certain way or judge me, but this is my story. This is my truth. And I have to speak it. And just, putting myself out there. And so that another woman that maybe is going through this, or even a younger girl, or who you never know, can see that, oh my God, she looks like me and she went through this and look at how far she's come. I can do that too. Then she can talk to, to her friends or to even her, someone else that she may know that may be in that situation. So I would say, I think that we have to do the work. So we have to put ourselves out there and help and volunteer and spend some of that time.
Thank you. You share your information with the Latino community too, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's great, because we need to get that out there too. All right. Thanks. Eddie, any other suggestions?
I've heard all great suggestions already, and as Lauren also said, she shared a lot of things. I think getting that information out there and letting everybody know that it's available. Involving the church again came up. I think that's true. I don't know how it would happen, but where would it happen at? We're working with young fellas where, well, let me just say this. I think hearing your stories are amazing. I wish I could find a batterer. I know Maisha said that her father became an intervention specialist. If we could have heard him sharing his story on that change to other men who batter as well. Hearing their stories is, like this ain't right. It's almost like the male paradox and people in the field know what I mean by that. I wrote a couple. Oh, also because we have this, Antoine Fisher's story. It was a poem in Antoine Fisher's story that says who will cry for the boy inside of me, something to that fact. And being able to deal with those issues, I'm even trying to be careful with that. It starts at home as well. I have 8 grandkids, and it's 5 girls and 3 boys. And when one of the girls falls or something, you know how it goes. It's like, baby, it's going to be okay. Don't cry. And then the fellas, I'll be like, man, get up, dust yourself off. And I think it starts way back then, and I still catch myself sometimes. And it's those things that we do as a society. We have to re-educate. I used to even look at magazine racks way back when, and it was magazine racks to help a woman who got a kid and got a job and doing this and doing that. But males, it was just about hunting or golfing. It was nothing about when you having emotional issues, because society doesn't think that you ought to cry for help or ask for help. And so I think we need to figure ways to address that, because it's still the same today, I think. And so they take it out on different situations, and mostly is the ones that they love. So addressing all those different areas. And the church again, because not only in domestic violence, but I think, and I'm a church leader, but I think we hide behind masks in church.
We do.
And we want to make like it's all good because I got Christ and everything is good and wonderful, until we start telling those truths. It's just like one quick verse one quick story. When the Israelites were coming out of Egypt, every time they run into trouble, they say, well, I might as well have stayed in Egypt. Even though it was horrible for them there, is because we couldn't show our true feelings and tell the truth about what it's really like. And so continue to tell our stories, as Sylvia said as well, and moving past the pain of the fear of not telling it, saying, hey, I used to say this, Sylvia, my purpose is bigger than my pain. Me not telling the story will be more painful for me not telling it. So just keep telling your story. Keep telling your story.
Maisha, looks like we're going to have to get your dad here to help us out with some things, huh?
Yeah, I was going to say that. So my dad had a stroke last year, so he's still recovering. But I know that there are video, anger management video. Oh gosh, there's so many things behind his name. I can't remember them all. But I am going to reach out and say, Daddy, I need stuff.
Sounds good.
Give me all your stuff so we can finish this work. So
hey, I don't mean to. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say I have a thing on anger management. I just want to put that out there, that I feel that us, and I'm not saying, I know you have a lot of other materials. When it comes to anger management, I feel like even myself, like, when my boss treat me a certain kind of way, I can manage my anger really good. But at home, my wife can say the same thing my boss says, and it seemed like I can't manage my anger at that time. So that tells me that I can manage my anger. I just wanted to throw that thought out there, because you manage it, you fool everybody else out there, but at home you seem to not be able to manage it. I just wanted to throw that out as a comment on anger management.
Allie, can you give us a little bit about what you think should be done or can be done to collaborate efforts for the grassroots work that we need to do?
Yeah. In terms of grassroots activity, I mean, I think we're very blessed in this community specifically to have many courageous survivors like Maisha and Sylvia speaking out and sharing their stories, because that's such a powerful way to connect with other people who might be swimming in that soup right now and need to see themselves in somebody else. And I think that speaks to the fact that addressing domestic violence and making it easy for people who are hurting and struggling to find help is something that the movement still has work to do on, because we can't expect that every survivor's gonna ever decide to call a hotline. We can't expect that any victim or survivor is ever going to look themselves in the mirror and necessarily see themselves as a victim or a survivor, or as Sylvia talked about, her pride said, no, I need to be a strong Puerto Rican woman. I can't be weak. And if I use some of those systems, I'm like telling the world that I'm weak. Now, it's not necessarily true, but if that's how you feel, then there has to be another place for you to access support. And for me, I never accessed any systems because I didn't know I was a victim. I mean, it came to a point when I did, but when I originally got connected to some help, it was through my healthcare provider. I showed up over and over and over again at my doctor with a litany of low-grade health complaints. I didn't have physical injuries. I wasn't talking about the sexual abuse I was experiencing at that time, but there was no outward bruises. There was no bruises, no broken bones. I didn't end up in the hospital for, like Sylvia shared in her story. And if my doctor finally said to me, I don't think there's anything, I don't think illness is the issue here. I think something's going on in your life and I want you to talk to someone. And she got me connected with a therapist, and I got really lucky that my therapist recognized abuse and violence, because many therapists don't. They only want to look at the depression or the anxiety, and they don't want to look at the root cause. So my mission for the next 12 years is going to be, how do we actually engage the healthcare systems in recognizing that when a person is currently being abused or has a history of abuse, this is what's going to show up in their health record. And we need you to find other ways to try to support them instead of just prescribing their way back to health, because it just doesn't work that way. So I want to create community that says, we're going to rise to meet victims and survivors wherever they show up, whether it's at the doctor's office, in your therapist's office, at your church. I don't want to have to push you through the door of a shelter to be able to help you. So
Thank you for that. And I just have to say one more thing just pertaining to that. Thank you, each one of you, because a lot of you have here on this call have been instrumental on making sure that doctors ask that question now, or when you go to the doctors. Because I know it was a long time coming that we tried to get this done. And so finally, when we go to the doctors do ask, are you safe at home? So thanks again for even pushing it as much as we did, okay? Jack, any last words on grassroots work before we get to?
Grassroots work. No, I just got to keep showing up. No, so much has been said tonight. I'm thankful to be part of this Rochester grassroots crew right here.
Thank you so much. And thank you for being a stand-up guy, okay? Thank you so much. Allie, was there a question that needed to be asked that was in there, or were they all answered?
Nope, we're all set.
Okay. So without, right now, I just want to say again, thank you to each one of you for coming on today and taking time out of your busy schedules to talk about this domestic violence issues that's going on in our communities, in our homes, and in our school, and even our churches or congregations, that I say. I truly, truly, truly appreciate your time. We did go over, but the conversation was amazing. So I thank you so much for participating and being able to share your stories, educate us on some things, and even probably bring a father into here and giving us some information or passing it baton to you. Okay. So I believe we have the Goddess Bliss on, who is going to lead us out with another poem.
Yay.
Let's take a moment of silence for your next door neighbor, whose walls are as thin as paper, like the ice she treads on every time he comes home from a hard day's labor. Nah, he don't got a job, but from whatever he does. He bought a bottle, so now he tries to swallow his pride, but his insides still feel hollow. It doesn't take a magician or mathematician to sum up the product of their division. And many nights, home-cooked meals were made minus the love. Mask and mistakes equate to merry misunderstandings, and he doesn't speak sign language, but he still talks to her with his hands. And You can still hear her cry at night while the rude words he used ricocheted off those walls like laser beams of light in a mirror maze. Swollen glands hidden behind shades obstruct her gaze. Silver spoons used to belittle her, leaving her self-esteem riddled with exit wounds. And if she could find an open window of opportunity, she would exit soon, I bet. But maybe not. She feels trapped, I bet. Pushed back by every push, punch, and slap. Love taps turn into attacks. And maybe she would testify and find someone to help her dig her out of this dark hole. But everyone she knows is too busy minding their own business, right? That's our ineffective guidance. Our collective silence forms a protective alliance, allowing this domestic violence. Don't you see? Our blind eye is her black eye. Our closed mouth is his closed fist, his bold lips that demoralize, apologize, and kiss, all in the same breath. A moment of silence. In fact, I'd say that stones and sticks will still break the bones of words that hit like boxing mitts. Heavy hands that hurt like hurricanes, just a natural disaster under our own roof. And sometimes the slaps start to shingle each side of the truth, don't they? I wonder if your neighbor is okay. Or is today another one of those, I'm all right, I'll get over it type of days? Or maybe today's the day that she snaps back or slaps back out of the denial phase? Or will she plot on how to get away with murder till he fades away? But perhaps she'll stop hiding the chipped tooth of truth one day. But then again, perhaps she'll stay silenced.